Have you ever been told that you are essential right before you were made to disappear? It's a strange feeling, isn't it? That quiet, constant pressure in the corporate world to give everything you have with the unspoken understanding that the system you serve has no memory, and even less loyalty. This isn't a story about loud arguments or dramatic revenge. It is about what happens when a system built on one person's knowledge tries to erase that person, only to discover that some foundations, once set, cannot be broken. So if you're watching this right now, maybe in your car, maybe on your lunch break, just tell me one thing: where are you listening from? Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to know how far this story travels. And if something in you recognizes something in this, stay with me. My name is Elena Vance, and for 8 years I had served as the chief architect of the very system that was now the centerpiece of a billion-dollar merger. I was not a founder by title, but I was the one who had built the engine while others were busy building the brand. My work was defined by logic and precision, a quiet dedication to making things function flawlessly. It was this dedication that made the document now sitting on my desk feel so profoundly out of place. It had been delivered by Marcus Thorne, our chief executive officer, a man who had joined the company 2 years ago and possessed a salesman's polished charm. He called it a final piece of paperwork, a simple formality to transfer all intellectual property, past, present, and future, squarely to the company just before the merger was finalized. I read the clauses twice, not with surprise, but with a feeling of cold recognition. The language was not that of a partner reaffirming a shared understanding. It was absolute and sweeping, a legal net designed to capture everything, leaving no room for nuance or the unwritten history of our early years. For a moment, I pictured the late nights and early mornings in a cramped office space long before Marcus' arrival, when the platform was just a collection of diagrams on a whiteboard and a belief shared between a handful of us. This document sought to erase that history, to flatten it into a single corporate-owned asset. I did not pick up the pen. Instead, I turned to my computer and composed a single, calm email, addressing it to Marcus and the head of human resources. It was a message crafted with deliberate and measured professionalism, devoid of any accusation or emotion. This document is quite comprehensive, I wrote, my fingers moving steadily across the keyboard. Before I proceed, could you please clarify which specific past projects this agreement is intended to cover? I pressed send and leaned back in my chair, the quiet hum of the servers in the next room filling the silence. The reaction was not a clarification. It was a sudden, tense quiet that emanated from the executive wing, a void that felt heavier and more suffocating than any shouted word. They had expected my silent compliance, not a reasonable question. That question hung in the air for the rest of the afternoon, unanswered. No one from Human Resources came to my desk. Marcus did not reply. It was a familiar tactic of corporate power, a silence meant to isolate, to make one feel small and unreasonable, to pressure them into capitulating without a direct confrontation. But I did not feel small. I felt a strange sense of clarity, a final confirmation of the direction Marcus had been steering the company all along, away from its creators and toward a narrative he could solely own and sell. He was not just preparing the company for a merger. He was tidying up the story, and I was a loose thread he intended to snip. I didn't get an answer that day. Instead, just before I was about to log off, a calendar invitation appeared on my screen for the following morning, a stark block of time with no subject line and no explanation. The meeting was not a private discussion about a contract. It was a full assembly in the main boardroom. When I walked in, I saw the senior team from our merger partner already seated, their faces illuminated by the glow of the large presentation screen. On that screen were my slides, the ones I had spent weeks refining. Marcus Thorne motioned for me to take a seat, not at the head of the table where I usually sat for these technical reviews, but along the side among the junior analysts. He began the meeting with his usual confident energy, but he did not introduce me. Instead, when the time came to discuss the core technology, he gestured toward Ben Carter, an ambitious engineer I had trained. Ben will be walking us through the technical architecture of the Atlas engine, Marcus announced, his voice smooth and certain. I felt a quiet shift in the room's gravity, a deliberate transfer of ownership happening right before my eyes. Ben started confidently, his words echoing the notes I had written in the speaker section of each slide. He navigated the surface-level details with ease, a capable narrator for a story he had not written. The performance was seamless, until the partner's chief technology officer, a sharp woman with a keen eye for detail, interrupted him. "This is all very impressive," she said, leaning forward. "But can you elaborate on how the system maintains data integrity during a live migration under heavy user load? What are its specific fail-safes?" The room went quiet. It was a simple, direct question, but it was a question that required a deep understanding of the foundation I had built, not just the blueprint I had drawn. I watched as Ben faltered. His confident posture tightened, and his response was a tangled collection of corporate buzzwords, mentioning robust scalability frameworks and synergistic data alignment without ever answering the fundamental question. He did not know the answer. I knew it intimately. I could have described the triple redundancy protocol I designed, or the way the system isolates and verifies data packets before committing them. But I remained silent, a spectator watching a play where my character had been written out. Before the awkwardness could fully set in, Marcus interjected with the practiced ease of a politician. "That's an excellent point for our deeper integration session," he said, smiling at the chief technology officer. "For the purpose of this top-level overview, we want to focus on the strategic value." He skillfully deflected, changing the subject and saving Ben from his own incompetence. The remainder of the meeting was a carefully managed performance, all style and very little substance. They were no longer selling a technology. They were selling a story about a technology, and the main character had just been replaced. I was no longer a key architect in the room. I was a ghost, a silent witness to my own erasure. The partners seemed satisfied, for the moment, but I wondered if they noticed the subtle crack in the foundation that had just been exposed. The meeting concluded, and as people began to stand and gather their things, Marcus walked directly past me, his gaze fixed on his new chosen expert. He placed a hand on Ben's shoulder, a gesture of public endorsement. "Good work today," Marcus said, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Let's get you set up with full administrative access this afternoon." The summons came less than an hour after Ben was granted his new authority. There was no formal meeting request, just a quiet tap on my shoulder from a representative from Human Resources, guiding me toward a small glass-walled conference room. The severance was as quiet and sterile as the room where it happened. Marcus was already there, seated with the same detached composure he had displayed in the boardroom. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He explained that as part of the strategic restructuring to streamline leadership ahead of the merger, my senior role was now considered redundant. My system access and company accounts, he informed me, were being disabled as we spoke. It was a clean and efficient cut, delivered with the impersonal precision of a surgeon. I did not argue. I did not ask for a reason beyond the corporate script he had just recited. There was nothing left to say. The last 24 hours had been the reason, a silent and methodical process of replacement that had made this final moment a mere formality. I simply nodded, a quiet acknowledgement of the end of my 8-year tenure. The Human Resources representative slid a thick envelope across the table, and I stood up. The entire exchange had lasted less than 5 minutes. They had condensed nearly a decade of my life, the thousands of hours I had poured into building their core asset, into a conversation shorter than a coffee break. As I walked back to my desk to collect my belongings, a strange calm settled over me. There was no anger, no sorrow, only a profound sense of distance, as if I were watching a scene from someone else's life. I packed a small box with a few books, a framed photo, and a coffee mug. It felt strangely light in my hands. On my way to the elevator, I passed my former assistant Chloe. Her face was pale, and she flinched when she saw me, quickly looking away. In her hands she was holding a freshly printed memo, and though I could not read the words, I knew its purpose. It was the carefully crafted narrative of my amicable departure to pursue new opportunities, a script designed to be distributed to the remaining staff, ensuring my erasure was smooth and without question. She wouldn't meet my eyes, and in her silent, averted gaze, I saw the true nature of the system I was leaving behind, one that demanded complicity in its own deceptions. I stepped into the elevator, the doors closing on her guilt-stricken face. As the car descended, I looked down at the box on the floor. It contained nothing of real value, just a few trinkets from a life I no longer inhabited. The real value, the true archive of my work and my worth, was not something they could pack into a box or dismiss with a memo. The box in my hands was light, but the laptop in my bag at home contained something that they had forgotten in their haste to remove me. It held a diagnostic key, a forgotten back door to the system's oldest and most fundamental server. I arrived home to the quiet of my apartment, the silence here feeling different from the charged, weaponized silence of the office. It was a genuine stillness, a space to think. I placed the small box of my corporate life on the kitchen counter and didn't open it. Instead, I walked into my home office, powered on my personal laptop, and for a long moment simply watched the cursor blink on a dark screen. There was no sense of urgency, no frantic rush to act. There was only a calm, methodical purpose, the same feeling I used to get right before solving a complex architectural problem. I was not planning a counterattack. I was ensuring the integrity of the historical record. Using the diagnostic key, I accessed the world I had built, the connection open not to the sleek modern interface the public saw, but to a forgotten corner of the digital infrastructure. A legacy server I had personally configured in a dusty closet during our first year of operation. It was a ghost entrance, a relic from a time before layers of corporate security and procedure, a back door no one but me remembered existed. My fingers moved with a familiar certainty, navigating pathways that were like muscle memory. I was not there to alter a single line of code, nor to interfere with their operations in any way. My objective was singular and defensive. I initiated a complete read-only backup of the entire platform. It was a slow process, a silent cascade of data transferring from their world to mine. I watched the progress bar inch across the screen, each percentage point representing a piece of my professional life being copied into a secure, encrypted archive on my private drive. It was more than just files and code, it was every project note, every hidden annotation, every failed experiment and every breakthrough that had led to the final elegant system they were now trying to claim. I was creating a digital time capsule, a perfect, incorruptible snapshot of the truth as it stood in that moment before they began to change things they did not, and could not, understand. This was not an act of revenge. It was an act of preservation. In their rush to erase my name from the present, they had assumed they could also rewrite the past. They believed the system was a machine that would continue to run regardless of who had built it. But a system like this is not just a machine, it is a living history. And I knew that soon, they would try to perform surgery on it without a map. This archive was that map, the original blueprint. And I was now its sole keeper. When the transfer was complete, I severed the connection for the final time, leaving no trace of my visit. The ghost entrance was closed. They had locked the front door, believing they were secure, but they had forgotten that I still held the original architectural plans and a key to the very foundation. For 2 weeks, there was only silence. I did not reach out to anyone, and no one reached out to me. I allowed the distance to grow, focusing on the quiet rhythm of my own life, deliberately pushing the noise of my former career to the background. I knew, with the certainty of an architect who understands the stress points of a structure, that the system would eventually show a crack. I did not have to wish for it. The flawed leadership of Marcus Thorne and the shallow expertise of Ben Carter made it an inevitability. The first sign of trouble arrived not as a phone call, but as a discreetly forwarded email from Chloe, my former assistant. There was no message from her, only the forwarded chain, a silent act of witness. The emails detailed a growing crisis with our largest client, a pharmaceutical giant that used our platform for the most sensitive and critical part of their work, simulating new drug trials. The system had not crashed. The failure was far more insidious. It had produced a set of simulation results that were flawed, not by a wide margin, but by a small, almost imperceptible degree that was just enough to be dangerously wrong. A quiet poison had been injected into their research data, and the client was demanding an immediate explanation. Panic was beginning to ripple through the internal messages, each reply more urgent than the last. I scanned the thread, my gaze moving over the frantic back and forth between the technical teams. They were looking for a bug in the recent updates, but the problem was not in what was new, it was in their lack of understanding of what was old. Deep in the chain, I saw the question that I had been waiting for. "This is the core cardiovascular simulation module," one of the senior engineers wrote. "It's been stable for 5 years. Who was the last person to architect this?" The replies came quickly, all pointing to the same answer: my name. I was a ghost haunting them through their own documentation. Ben Carter's responses were defensive, full of corporate jargon that failed to hide his growing alarm. He blamed legacy code and a lack of proper documentation, criticisms that I knew were simply a shield for his own ignorance. The final email in the chain, however, was the one that confirmed the next stage of their decline. It was from Ben, sent late at night, his frustration palpable even in text. "This is an unacceptable failure of a legacy component," he wrote to the team. "I will isolate the module and patch it myself tonight. We cannot be held hostage by old architecture." I closed the email. He called it old architecture, but it was the very heart of the engine. I knew then, with absolute certainty, that he was about to take a hammer to a watch mechanism. He was not going to fix the first fracture. He was about to shatter the entire foundation. That night, I opened the ghost entrance to the system again. I did not do it out of malice, but with a sense of grim professional curiosity, the same way a master watchmaker might observe an amateur trying to repair a complex timepiece with the wrong tools. I simply needed to see the results of the experiment. The server logs, which were normally a steady, rhythmic stream of text indicating a healthy system, were now a frantic, disorganized flood. I had a direct, unfiltered view into the digital heart of the company, and I could see the sweat and panic in every command Ben Carter typed. He was not making a delicate adjustment. He was performing a brute force intervention. I watched as he pushed a system-wide patch, overriding the nuanced validation protocols I had spent years creating. He was treating the platform not as an interconnected ecosystem, but as a simple engine that could be forced into compliance. For a moment, it seemed to work. The initial errors from the pharmaceutical client's simulation subsided, replaced by a wave of system alerts that Ben likely interpreted as success. But I knew he had not solved the problem. He had merely suppressed the symptom by creating a much larger, more fundamental illness. The proof came less than an hour later. The system's core processors began to spike, and new, unrelated errors started to cascade through previously stable modules. The client onboarding process, which had been functioning perfectly that morning, suddenly began to fail. Then came the critical mistake, the moment of pure hubris that sealed their fate. I saw a command executed under Ben's administrative profile to delete a core configuration file. It was a file I had named with a clear and simple warning in its title. doc_delete_legacy_stability. I remembered creating it on a Sunday afternoon 6 years ago to solve a complex data synchronization issue. It was the keystone that held the entire structure in balance, and he had just thrown it away, likely dismissing it as digital clutter. I felt a quiet intake of breath, not in shock but in final absolute recognition of the outcome. He had not just broken a feature, he had severed the system's spine. The platform was now irrecoverably unstable without a full restoration from a clean backup, a backup that only I possessed. I watched for another 10 minutes as the digital heartbeat of the company became erratic and weak, a flurry of red warnings signaling a system now at war with itself. He had tried to prove he was in control, and in doing so had created a chaos far beyond his ability to manage. I logged out, having seen enough. The next day a new forwarded message from Chloe appeared. It was not an email chain this time, but a transcript of an internal team chat. The messages were short, panicked, and frequent. Onboarding is completely down, the data sync is failing for everyone. And then the names started to appear. Where are Ella Laner's old notes? Did anyone actually get a proper handover from her? My name was no longer a ghost in their archives, it was becoming the only word they could think of for a solution. The internal chaos had finally escalated to the executive level. When their technical solutions failed, they predictably turned to another instrument of power, the law. A week after the system was crippled by Ben's misguided repairs, a courier delivered a thick cream-colored envelope bearing the name of a notoriously aggressive corporate law firm. I didn't need to open it to know what it contained. This was not an apology or an offer to reconcile, it was an act of intimidation, the next move in their playbook of flawed strategies. Marcus, having failed to control the technology, was now trying to seize it through legal force. I sat at my kitchen table and read the letter. It was a masterclass in formal threatening language, citing legal precedents and clauses from my original employment contract. The argument was simple. They claimed the company was the rightful owner of the intellectual property for the Atlas engine, asserting it was a work for hire. The letter concluded with a clear demand: sign a full transfer of all rights to them within 10 business days or face immediate legal action. They were trying to corner me with the threat of a costly battle. I read the letter twice, not with fear but with a sense of weary disappointment. They were so predictable, still believing this was a problem that could be solved by being the most powerful voice in the room. They had failed to understand the system I built, and now they were failing to understand the woman who built it. I did not call my lawyer in a panic. My actions were as quiet and deliberate as they had been the day I was fired. I went to my computer and opened an old archived folder from my earliest days at the company. It took less than a minute to find the file I needed. It was not a complex legal document, but a simple email sent on a Saturday 8 years ago by the company's original founder and chief executive officer, a good man who retired long before Marcus' arrival. I remembered the conversation vividly. We were in a vulnerable funding round and he was worried about a hostile takeover. His email was a follow-up, giving me his explicit blessing to file the patent under my own name. "This is our company's heart, Eleanor," he had written, "and for now, you are the safest person to hold the key. We trust you." I attached the simple time-stamped email to a new message and sent it to my lawyer with a single line of instruction: "Please forward this to them." I added no other context. Their entire legal threat was built upon the assumption that my ownership was a secret they could exploit. But my ownership was not an oversight, it was a foundational agreement, a documented promise from the man who started it all. Their power move was a bluff, and I had just called it with a single undeniable fact. After my lawyer forwarded the founder's email, a new kind of silence fell. I had expected a begrudging reply from their legal team, but days passed with no response. They were paralyzed, unsure of their next move now that their weapon of intimidation had been neutralized. The critical blow, however, came not from me but from the one party they could not afford to ignore. The information arrived in a late-night message from Chloe, attached to the official minutes of an emergency call. "They just got off a call with the merger partners," she wrote. "It did not go well." I opened the document and read not as an architect but as an observer of a collapse. The minutes began with Marcus and Ben offering reassurances about the platform instability, framing it as minor technical issues. They were selling their polished narrative of control. Then the partner's chief technology officer spoke. I remembered her from the boardroom, the sharp, precise woman whose question had first exposed Ben's incompetence. Her words, even transcribed, carried an unmistakable weight of authority. "We appreciate the update, Marcus," her statement began. However, our own teams have flagged concerns that go beyond temporary issues. We've noted the system's instability seems directly correlated with the departure of its primary architect, Miss Eleanor Vance. My name, written there in the official record. She continued, her logic relentless. Furthermore, our independent legal review has flagged a potential ownership conflict regarding the intellectual property of the engine. Can you clarify Miss Vance's relationship with the company and the legal chain of title for this technology? The question was a masterpiece of corporate precision, weaving together the technical failures, my departure, and the legal questions into a single devastating narrative. It was the one question they could not answer without revealing their mismanagement. I scrolled down the page, and the next entry in the transcript sent a quiet chill through me. It was not a response from Marcus or a deflection from Ben, it was a single stark notation from the transcriber, 5-minute pause on the line. They had been rendered speechless. They were so focused on their internal battle with me, they never imagined their partner would conduct their own thorough due diligence. The truth wasn't leaked by me, it was discovered by simple competence. The final line of the minutes was as cold as a death certificate. The partners have requested a temporary pause on all proceedings to reconsider the strategic alignment of the merger. I closed the file. The billion-dollar deal was frozen, shattered not by an attack but by a logical question they could not answer. The news of Marcus Thorne's departure came in a quiet internal memo about new leadership. He had been asked to step aside, a sterile corporate euphemism for a quiet, bloodless coup. The silence that followed was different. It was the heavy, waiting silence of a company that had run out of moves and was finally facing its self-inflicted wound. The call came a few days later from a number I did not recognize. The voice belonged to a senior board member, his polished tone worn thin by crisis. He did not waste time. He stated the facts of their dire situation. The platform was experiencing cascading failures, major clients were pausing their contracts and their desperate call for help, the final stage of workplace revenge. The merger partners would not return to the table. He laid the entire disaster at my feet, not as an accusation but as a plea. We are prepared to move forward with a licensing agreement on whatever terms your counsel proposes, he began, his voice dropping slightly. But first, Eleanor, we need your help. The system is unraveling in ways no one here can predict. We need you to tell us how to fix what you built. He fell silent then, waiting for me to provide the easy answer that would make his problems disappear. I let his words hang in the air, the silence stretching on, now a tool of my own making. I did not feel triumph, only a hollow sense of the inevitable. They had torn down the house and were now standing in the rubble asking the architect for the blueprint. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm and measured, carrying no trace of anger. Everything you need to stabilize the system, I said softly, is in the architectural documentation I submitted over the years. I paused, letting the weight of my next words settle. The problem your team is facing is not a lack of information. It is a lack of understanding. I offered nothing more. I did not give him a solution, only a diagnosis. The issue was not a single bug but a fundamental incompetence they had allowed to fester. He was asking for a key, but I had given him a mirror, forcing him to look at the true source of their failure. The call ended without a resolution, leaving them with a problem far more difficult than the one they thought they had. They did not call back for a week. I imagine that week was filled with frantic meetings as they searched for a way around the difficult truth I had given them. But there was no way around it. Their only path forward was to accept my diagnosis. The negotiation for the licensing agreement was not a negotiation at all, it was a surrender. My lawyer communicated my terms, which were restrictive, precise, and financially significant. They were a reflection not of revenge but of the true cost of the asset they had taken for granted. They agreed to everything without a single counteroffer. They had no other choice. The merger eventually went through, but it was a shadow of the triumphant deal Marcus had envisioned. It was a quiet transaction, completed at a fraction of the original valuation, a quiet failure cloaked in the public language of a strategic success. My old company continued to operate, a hollowed-out version of its former self, now paying a quarterly fee for the very technology that had once been its birthright. My name was never mentioned in their press releases, but it was on every invoice they were now forced to pay. Their story and my part in it was over. But in the quiet aftermath, a new story was beginning. I founded my own firm, not with a grand ambition to conquer the market but with a simple philosophy, to build things that last, with people who respect the work. I did not need to advertise. Clients came to me, seeking the clarity and stability my old company could no longer provide. The best of my former team eventually found their way to me as well. Chloe, my old assistant, was the first to join, her confidence restored. She was followed by others, talented engineers and strategists who had grown tired of a culture that valued perception over substance. We did not just rebuild a platform. We rebuilt a philosophy. Here, in our bright, open office, the whiteboard is once again the most important tool we own. Sometimes, as I am sketching out the logic for a new system, I think back to that other life. I feel no anger, no bitterness. I only see the quiet, undeniable proof that you cannot erase a creator and still keep the value of their creation. You are only left with an empty space, an echo where the core used to be. My old company still exists, a client, paying to use an engine whose heart they do not understand. They have the code, but they lost the knowledge. They have the platform, but they lost the vision. They could run the machine, but they could no longer claim its soul. That had left with me. In the end, this story was never truly about revenge. It is a quiet reminder that silence is not weakness. Sometimes it is the most powerful position you can hold. It is the moment you stop explaining your worth to people who are committed to misunderstanding it. If you have ever had to quietly walk away from a room, a project, or a place that no longer deserved your expertise, know that you are not alone. If this spoke to you, like, comment, and share it with someone who's still finding their own.